Okay. I thought it was the first way.
Yeah.
For our colleagues in judiciary, we're back on.
Oh, sorry. Nice, Patty.
Our resident chef, Representative Byron, Vice Chair of the committee. Making sure everybody has food and hot sauce here. So my apologies to those of you who are missing out on House Judiciary. Well fed, well caffeinated.
Well, they got cookies.
So we're back here in Room 10, the House Government Operations and Military Affairs Committee, and we're zoomed in jointly with the House Judiciary Committee hearing testimony about the roles and responsibilities of Vermont sheriffs. Next up, we have Judge Thomas Zone, who's the Chief Superior Judge of the Vermont Judiciary, and Terry Corsonis, who we have seen, who's our court administrator. So thank you both for being here and telling us a little bit about the court's relationships with the Vermont sheriffs.
Well, Chair McCarthy, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And do you need us to repeat as well who we are to start? Or?
No, I think it's fine. I teed things up.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate the opportunity. In terms of the roles and responsibilities of the Vermont sheriffs, we assume that you would want us to talk about from the perspective of courthouse security, because that's how we're connected and have been historically since the beginning of courthouses, I think, in the state of Vermont. As the Legislative Council alluded to, this dates back centuries in terms of the roles. And we've been very grateful for the assistance that Vermont sheriffs have provided to courthouses for security through today. And I thought I'd just give a little overview in terms of what the courthouse security situation is at the courthouses. And then Judge Zoning was going to comment on different information that was shared this morning and the judiciary's perspective on that, if that's okay.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
We did provide slides that apparently you all are accessing or can access. So again, this is a very broad kind of overview of courthouse security vis-a-vis the sheriffs. And we have a Vermont Judiciary Security and Safety Program within the Court Administrator's Office that oversees courthouse security. We have 26 courthouses throughout the state. All counties have at least one courthouse. The larger courthouses have two courthouses. The larger counties have two courthouses. Typically, if there are two courthouses, the older courthouse is oftentimes the original county courthouse that has civil and probate divisions. And then the newer courthouse oftentimes has criminal and family divisions. When we had the restructuring in 2010, they were unified. The smaller counties might have one courthouse then that typically was the original county courthouse that houses all four divisions. But all the courthouses require security. Each courthouse within the state has at least one screener at the door, which is kind of the main defense, if you will, because they screen for weaponry or anything that could increase the risk of harm for anybody entering the courthouse. And then typically within the courthouses, there's a court security officer within a criminal courtroom at all times, typically in a family courtroom, unless it's all remote viewings. And if it's a civil courtroom or a probate courtroom, it's as the need arises. But that's kind of the general overview of what kind of courthouse security presence there is throughout the courts. We utilize, originally it was all sheriff deputies that provided courthouse security. And as the number of courthouse deputies became reduced, we've had to supplement through a combination of the sheriffs, primarily then private security agencies and state of Vermont personnel. And the next slide does give kind of an overview of the composition. Presently, county sheriff deputies comprise 53% of the security presence at courthouses today. There are also court security officers that are employed by the judiciary. They're primarily in Chittenden County, but that's 25% of the courthouse security presence. Then there's a private security firm called Securitas, that's 14%. And then most recently, we've also hired court officers as limited service personnel for 8%. Again, to ensure that we have kind of the minimum security presence that's needed at courthouses in order to conduct court hearings. And if you're interested, the next slide then shows in terms of the sheriff deputy personnel, there are 40 of them, 40 positions throughout the state currently. The next page shows the breakdown by county in terms of how many sheriff's deputies there are per county. And you'll see that there are Bennington, Lemoyle, and Rutland have 6+ sheriff's deputies. And then there are counties that have around three sheriff's deputies, which would be, Caledonia, Franklin, Orleans, and Windsor. And then 2 or fewer in Addison, Chittenden, Grand Isle, and Wyndham. Kind of the rough breakdown of how the sheriff's deputies are spread out throughout the state. And then we've had far fewer visitors to the courthouses during the last several years because of the pandemic. And this just gives you kind of a chart for fiscal year 2022, showing the number of security incidents by court location. And then the last page just shows the security census, a total of 13,423 visitors to courthouses in fiscal year 22, which is an increase from the previous year when we had such limitations on the courthouses. And it's basically increasing as we're resuming in-person hearings and a combination of either hybrid in-person remote hearings or remote hearings. So the numbers are going back up, but not nearly the numbers before we instituted the remote hearing option during the pandemic. So that's kind of a broad overview in terms of sheriff deputy personnel at the courts. We're extremely grateful for the sheriff deputy security presence and really appreciate both John Campbell and Andy Noonan have been terrific. Sheriff Marcoux, Sheriff Anderson, and working with us to trying to be able to utilize as many, sheriff deputies as we possibly can. But that's the kind of the numbers today in the situation that is today because of a variety of factors, most noticeably of late, the workforce issues and sheriffs wanting to hire and not having the applicants. I saw a hand.
Representative Murphy, so go ahead, Mike.
Thank you for coming in and sharing this. A clarification question or definition here. The private security, when they're at courthouses, they do not have the authority that a sheriff deputy has. Is that accurate? That if someone needs to be arrested or taken into custody, they are not, so you have to call.
That is correct. They don't have they do not have the levels of certification that law enforcement do. It's my understanding that they do, some of them have been certified to be able to be armed, but not I don't know if they've been able to achieve level 3, for example, probably not.
I'm almost certain that Representative Lalonde has a question for you about this.
Okay.
I in fact don't.
So one thing that I thought I was trying to read your mind, Representative Lalonde, was to just understand, do all of the counties have sheriff deputies at the courthouses, or is it
Grand Isle is the only county that right now does not have any sheriff personnel. They're utilizing the state employees, I think, for the court security.
I thought it was a Securitas.
Oh, is it Securitas?
Oh. We were there in December, but I
He wants to.
Okay.
We're doing Securitas.
Okay.
But no sheriff.
Oh, okay. So it must have been a Securitas. I remember him saying he came from Chittenden County, but he must have been a Securitas employee. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I will go ahead and ask a question if I can.
Go ahead, Mr.
Now
Chair.
that you've given me a moment, thank you, Mike, for prompting me. So, I mean, we have heard from numerous court officials, including Justice Reiber, who was in here introducing himself and talking a bit about the courts last week. I think it was last week. That there's still some serious issues of getting the security in the courtrooms. Actually, Justice Reiber encouraged us to enact legislation that said sheriffs shall provide security to all the courthouses. So could you talk a little bit about the issues that you're facing and not having sufficient security and how that might affect the throughput in the courts or courts being able to be open and accessible?
Sure. If I could, when you come to our courthouses, we have an obligation to keep everyone safe. whether it's the judges, the staff, the public, the litigants, the victims, anyone who walks into that building, we have an obligation. Where does that obligation begin? At the front door. Because if someone walks in with a weapon and intends to use it, we need to take steps to make sure they can't get in with that weapon. So we have screeners at the front door. Historically, screeners have been law enforcement officers. If they see contraband, if they see something that is occurring that should be addressed, they can address that. When we don't have adequate sheriff coverage, we don't have the ability to have that law enforcement officer at the front door. Well, let's assume, yes, we can get an officer at the front door. Well, then we need an officer in the courtroom. When you're having criminal hearings or volatile family hearings, relief from abuse proceedings or other matters, it's important to have security in the courtroom also. If we don't have law enforcement who's able to be in there, we lose that ability for that additional level of protection. You also have the situation of people in the halls. So in many courts, we try to have roamers, someone else walking around to see what's going on. That's another level of protection. When we don't have adequate security in the courtrooms or at the front door, we can't open, literally. If we're told you only have one sheriff at your building and you want to do a jury trial, we scramble. We have to send people down from Montpelier. We are shifting people. We are moving people. And so not having adequate security has been an issue that we have been facing since we've been coming, if you will, back online after the pandemic and we got things moving. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that within the past year, John Campbell, Annie Noonan, and actually Sheriff Marcoux and Sheriff Anderson, they have worked with us. When we've had issues and we've had problems, we need to move people, they have all worked to try to effectuate what we needed. But we heard from 2 out of 14 today for sheriffs that they can't fill in the needs in every county. And so the problem we run into, and Representative Lalonde, is that if we don't get adequate security, we do have days where we say we have no sheriffs, we can't do X kind of hearing or Y kind of hearing. And that is problematic. That directly affects our ability to open the courts. Right now, we are able to keep courts open, but what is the level of security we're providing? Well, if we don't have law enforcement there with arrest powers, then what do? We have to call some local police to come in. So that's why it's critical to have at least one sheriff in the building at all times. So if the private security or Securitas needs to identify someone for arrest or law enforcement needs to address it, there's someone in the building who can do that. But the problem is, what if that someone happens to be the screener? Then he or she has to leave their post, go into the courtroom, and who's screening now? So we don't have anyone there. And so it's like dominoes sometimes. Things just keep leading to additional problems. And so we have had this issue that I think Chief Justice Reiber said it, whether it's by statute or some other approach, we do need that stability and knowledge that we're going to have security on an ongoing basis that can be relied upon. Sheriffs have provided, I would say, the gold standard for our security for years, and we want to keep that. As our slide showed, it was more than 50% of what we're using now. Well, that number used to be higher. And I know sheriffs have had difficulty with hiring individuals and retaining individuals, but when we are using them, that puts us in the best position to do what we need to do in the courts, and that is administer justice in a safe and appropriate manner.
Oh, sorry, Representative Long.
Yeah, so do you have any statistics as far as how many court days have been lost or the actual impact from not having security? If you don't have them available right now, certainly it would be helpful.
I do not have that specific information because oftentimes what occurs is, okay, we have no security for this day or that day. We might not be able to do this type of hearing, but the staff works and the court system works to try to pivot, if you will. Okay, let's try to do something else.
Yeah,
So, well-
for example, we had a jury trial in Rutland Civil, in the Rutland County Courthouse. And then the court officer called in sick at the last minute. We ended up then borrowing, if you will, a court officer from the Rutland Criminal Division because they had a hearing that canceled. But it's that kind of constant scrambling, which we've never had that in years past, that now it's kind of every day, are we going to have a security presence just because of the situation? But so, Representative Lalonde, I can inquire of trial court operations. I don't know, for example, that we would have a data geared to that, but we can try to get at least an estimate for you anecdotally, if nothing else. But we do everything we can possible because hearing dates in hearing rooms in courtrooms are so precious. We do everything possible to not have to cancel, especially when we're trying to address a backlog.
I think that anecdotally, that the headlines, the kind of issues that we've been hearing in places like Franklin County have exacerbated some of the staffing issues that have led to this?
You mean the security staffing issues?
Yes.
Oh, I would imagine definitely so. The sheriff's office would be the best people to respond to that, but I would assume so.
So, I just want to, yeah, this, I don't think we need to address that right now. I think we're really focusing on some of the various issues with sheriffs, but at some near future time, would certainly like to understand the court's plans for addressing this issue, unless that's something you want to hit on right now.
I think we can do that in the future.
Well, we'll schedule you in a couple weeks and you can come up with a game plan by then. So thank you.
I like that idea. Thank you.
Thank you. The legislative council personnel, it was very interesting, the background they provided. So we will plan to explore that.
Yeah, I think many of us have got lists and lists of questions that we now will need to delve into, a lot of work and reading to do. And I am seeing the testimony that you and others have offered today are starting to give us a sense of the picture of how sheriffs conceived historically and how that's evolved, the differences. So we're just kind of laying the groundwork here today. And I hope that we'll be able to have you back as we start to consider some of the remedies. And to Chair Lalonde's concern about helping you have the security that you need, I think we both would want to be partners and help in making sure that folks are safe when they're coming to the courts. And that seems like a basic value that I'm sure we all share. So thank you for being here today and helping us have a better understanding of how important that law enforcement presence at the courts is.
Well, we so appreciate the opportunity, and please don't hesitate. Call and we'll gather whatever data we didn't have today.
Okay, great. Last question, Representative Hooper, and then we'll.
Well, just, Mr. Chair, might be interesting to hear from the sheriffs themselves whether their positions are full or whether they're having the same personnel problem that everybody is having where you can't fill.
I think Sheriff
rolls out everywhere else.
I think Sheriff Anderson touched on this, but I think there's an overarching challenge with law enforcement staffing across the state in both sheriffs and the Vermont State Police. We heard that from Commissioner Morrison. So I think he touched on that briefly, but when we have the sheriffs back, I think we should talk about if there are ways that we can help with the training and the staffing. And I think we'll also be taking that up with some of the recommendations that we've received from the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. And should let everybody know we will be getting a bill with some requests from the Vermont Criminal Justice Council in the next couple of weeks. Great. Well, thank you both for joining us. I'd like to welcome County State's Attorney John Lavoie to testify next. Also wanted to just let the committees know, since we were running behind, State Auditor Doug Hopper agreed to reschedule. So we'll be having him back in, and if Judiciary Committee wants to try to schedule that together, we can figure that out offline. But going to try to get the State Auditor in later so that we can all attend the EAA Caucus of the Whole at noon. So thank you very much, State's Attorney Lavoie, for being here.
Thanks, Mike. So I am the newly elected freshly sworn in state's attorney in Franklin County. But I have been a prosecutor for 35 years, and I have worked in Wyndham and Bennington County. I was with the Southern Vermont Drug Task Force before I joined the Franklin County State's Attorney's Office as a deputy. And when my boss left in September, I took over the duties as state's attorney and did survive an election and was sworn in this morning. Sheriffs in our state were the basis of law enforcement when law enforcement was centered at a county level. And when the state police were created in the 1940s, the sheriffs still existed, obviously, and their role in law enforcement did not diminish. The idea was that state and municipal law enforcement would supplement the sheriff and county law enforcement. Now, over the years, when the Criminal Justice Training Council was created in the 1960s, municipal law enforcement and state police worked hand in hand with the Criminal Justice Training Council, and certifying and retaining law enforcement became a mutual operation between the Criminal Justice Training Council and these various state agencies. If there was a problem with a law enforcement officer, if there was a complaint against him or her, the Criminal Justice Training Council could step in, review the case, and potentially suspend or revoke their certification. That doesn't apply to our elected sheriffs. There is no requirement that our elected sheriffs be a certified law enforcement officer. I guess just like there's no requirement that the state's attorney be a lawyer. However, if a state's attorney is not a lawyer, he or she can't go into court and practice because that's against the law. There's nothing to stop a sheriff from being sheriff if he or she is not a certified law enforcement officer. Now, technically, I suppose they would not be able to make an arrest or sign an affidavit, but they could certainly run an office. There's nothing to stop them doing that. And I am in the unique position of having a newly elected sheriff who might be headed down that road. His certification is under review right now because of a very public incident where he kicked a shackled prisoner in the groin area. That is the subject of a criminal prosecution, but even if he is convicted of that offense, he'd still be the sheriff. There's nothing to prevent him continuing as sheriff with that conviction. Even if he went to jail, I guess somebody else would have to step in for a while, but from his jail cell, he would still be the sheriff. The process for removing a non-elected official is fairly simple. I mean, compared to what it would take to remove an elected sheriff. The chief of a municipal department can suspend, can fire someone who is accused of misconduct. The kind of misconduct that our current elected sheriff is accused of would certainly, did result in his removal when he had someone supervising him. But it's not prevented his taking office this morning. Our county depends heavily on sheriffs for law enforcement. The town of St. Albans recently decided not to renew their contract with the sheriffs, but last year, when they were still policing the town, they generated 6,000 cases. Now, the city is going to assume that contract, but Enosburg generated nearly 700 cases by sheriffs. The little town of Richford, 700 cases. The town of Fairfax, over 900 cases. Who's going to take care of that if the Franklin County sheriffs do not? Now, the problem with the deputies is statewide in terms of staffing. But who's going to be leading the Franklin County deputy state's attorney, deputy sheriffs? Who's going to be leading them? Someone who has kicked a shackled prisoner in the groin and is currently under investigation for financial malfeasance. Impeachment's possible, I know, but impeachment is a process, a legislative process that's certainly not lightly undertaken, but even if it is undertaken, will not be a speedy process. And in the meantime, the Sheriff's Department in Franklin County will have that person for a leader. And I think of a case where a deputy sheriff might be accused, a Franklin County deputy sheriff might be accused of abusing a prisoner. What will it mean to have that situation reviewed by a superior who's currently similarly charged? What standard of behavior would there be in that department? Now, I could prosecute a deputy sheriff, although we elected after consultation with our executive director to at least move the prosecution out of Franklin County to Grand Isle. And the state's attorney in Grand Isle, Doug DeSabato, agreed to assume that responsibility. We are still, though, the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. So that's not an ideal situation. There's at least an, as John Campbell put it, an appearance of impropriety when we're essentially prosecuting one of our own. Although he's not a state's attorney, he's certainly the sheriff in a Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. The Attorney General has stepped in prosecution of other law enforcement officers where there's been a prosecution or a conflict for prosecution on a local level. But maybe things just move a little more slowly in a larger office. Prosecutions of certain police officers accused of misconduct have taken years, and it wasn't just pandemic years to get to trial. So we're worried about that. And if y'all are familiar with the obligation that state's attorneys, prosecutors in general have to disclose issues that affect an officer's credibility under our Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court obligations. So we put out these Brady letters that talk about problems with an officer's credibility. Well, we put out a Brady letter referencing the new sheriff based on statements he's made about the incident that he's charged with. But the Brady letter doesn't prevent him, again, from being sheriff and would not prevent him signing an affidavit and presenting a case, even with that issue. Now, I could use my discretion to go further with my Brady letter and say, well, I'm just not going to prosecute any cases that come out of the Franklin County Sheriff's Department. And that would indeed be cutting my nose off to spite my face. And the only people that would suffer as a result of that would be victims in cases that wouldn't get prosecuted or couldn't get prosecuted. And the state police are already stretched so dreadfully thin that the idea of them assuming responsibility for some of these little towns that have generated, thousands of cases, that's just not practical. The response time, if the sheriffs aren't on duty, the response time in Richford for an emergency can be 45 minutes. And that's just not an acceptable situation. So the median ground was to issue a Brady letter just hiding the credibility issues. But I may have this situation go on for 4 years. Now, if the part of legislation suggesting the constitutional amendment to require at least that the sheriff be certified by the Criminal Justice Training Council, that would make removal a much more streamlined process, because certification could be removed by the Criminal Justice Training Council just as it's removed from a lower level officer without having to go through an impeachment process.
Thank you, John, for teeing some of that up. I know there are going to be some questions. I see a hand here from Representative Hoover.
You say the impeachment process will be rather lengthy. Do you have an idea of how long?
No, well, I could do it in an afternoon. I could,
Well, then let's get you on.
I could name that tune in one note. This one seems like a gimme to me. Seems like low-hanging fruit. It doesn't seem as complex as even a financial malfeasance issue where there might be, a technical defense. This one, you either buy it or you don't. And I think that we've come to a point, fortunately, in our oversight of law enforcement, so that the behavior that we've seen in this particular instance just isn't acceptable.
Representative Hango, and then I'll see if there are folks in judiciary that have any questions.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned certification could be removed by the Criminal Justice Training Council, but where does that leave us? That leaves us with an officer who's in charge administratively, but can't investigate crimes.
No. What I'm saying is, if you pass the constitutional amendment requiring that the sheriff be certified, then removal of his certification is tantamount to removal from office. Right now, we're going to have the situation that you've just described.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I was confused. I'm sorry I missed
Sure.
And did I understand you, John, that you have discretion about, even though there's the Brady letter, if the sheriff's office is investigating a case, they make an arrest, and then that's referred to your office. The Brady letter basically says that particular law enforcement officer that has issues with their credibility, is that the?
Yeah, so a Brady letter will apply to a particular officer's credibility. So the Brady letter that's has issued in reference to the sheriff-elect, not to any other deputy sheriff. So I still intend to prosecute cases that are referred by the Franklin County Sheriff's Department unless the sheriff-elect happens to be the affiant, in which case I would have to take a much closer look. And what I mean by that is I'm not going to reject it out of hand if there's a victim involved, because again, I don't want the victim to suffer. But if it's a non-victim case and it comes to me with the sheriff's signature, then that case will be declined.
So not to want to ask you a loaded hypothetical, but it would seem to me, and maybe you could agree or disagree, that if I was a town like Richford or Enosburg, where I had a contract with the sheriff's office, and there was a much greater probability that cases brought by the sheriff's office for crimes committed in my municipality were going to be actually brought to prosecution by the state's attorney, that would make me really seriously question my confidence in the sheriff's office. I mean, isn't that a fundamental issue that we have here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if these other towns go the way that St. Albans town did in terms of not renewing their contract with the sheriff's department, I'm not going to be dancing and singing because, again, it represents a much greater burden for the state police that are already stretched way too thin. So I want you to get rid of the sheriff, just what I want you to do. But, you know, that's another discussion.
Yeah, it seems we heard earlier before you arrived, and I appreciate you coming down on the day that you were sworn in. We did hear that would be a pretty complicated process. Representative Higley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. A question on your comment regarding a constitutional amendment where the Criminal Justice Council can decertify, which would then mean that they could not carry out their job. Isn't there, or is there a provision for appeal? And could that appeal then go to the courts, not through the council?
Yes.
Okay, so again, it still could take some time.
Yeah, it's not instantaneous for sure. I mean, even the current review of the sheriff-elect that's in process has been in process for a number of months. And as far as I know, as of today, there's been no decision.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple hands up in the room. Representative Lalonde, did you want to jump in? Does anybody have questions in judiciary?
So far, we're good. Thank you.
Okay. Representative Chase and Representative Hango.
If a sheriff is still in office with a proven history of violence against civilians and so forth, could towns or individuals get restraining orders or protective orders against him that would, he could still do his job just over there away from?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that restraining orders, protective orders are usually person-specific and not geographically specific. Or, you would have to show that there was a particular threat. If you were looking for a group, there'd have to be a particular threat to that group. And I suppose hypothetically, if we want to stretch things real thinly, we could say, well, look, he's abused a prisoner and all of us are potential prisoners that might have a little too much to drink at a party one night and meet this guy by the side of the road. But I can't imagine that that's going to fly.
Appreciate the creative thinking though, and how difficult this situation may present itself. Representative Hanko.
Just a point of clarification. Thank you for people who might be listening that are unfamiliar with the process. The constitutional amendment process is a 4-year process, correct, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, so folks, may recall that this last November, there were 2 propositions, 2 and 5, that were on the ballot before the voters that were both adopted. It is a 4-year process. It has to be passed by 2 separate general assemblies in 2 separate biennia, the exact same language, and then voted on by the public. It's one of the few things where we actually put language before voters. It's quite a process. And so until we do that. So I think we may have muddled the conversation a bit here. And just for clarity, I wanted to focus today on the structural issues and get this committee and our colleagues in House Judiciary to have some understanding of the limits of legislative power because of this exact thing. But we're mostly talking about history, structure, law, roles and responsibilities. I think that there may come a time when we're having a more intense conversation about impeachment. That's not our conversation here today, but some of the concerns that State's Attorney Lavoie has brought up definitely are making the gears in my head turn. And I imagine many folks in the public are going to be having some serious concerns and questions for us as well. Representative Lalonde, do you have a question in judiciary?
Yes, go ahead, Coach.
Good morning, everyone. To get back to that question about a protective order, I do understand it can't be against a geographic situation, but if I request it on an individual, no matter who that individual is, can I request that protective order? You know, and it, you know, to be clear, let's say a particular individual sheriff, not a deputy, but an individual sheriff has demonstrated his or her inability to work with people of color, for example. And I might have had a bad experience with that individual. Could I request a no contact order or what have you from that person or on that person?
Sure.
I just wanted to figure that out. Thank you.
This is your fault.
I think we're good otherwise, Mike.
Thank you.
So I think you've given us an awful lot to think about. Are there any final questions here in the room for State's Attorney Lavoie, Representative Nugent?
Kind of on that same theme, I'm concerned about the potential danger to future youth. I'm sure everyone is. I'm wondering if there's anything that can be done, I don't know, in a practical sense, in immediacy, or like what are the pressures around this sheriff that will potentially protect future detainees, or are we just kind of?
Well, my hope is that, like most of his predecessors, he will assume an administrative role. I still have concerns, of course, because he's going to be the ultimate supervisor for deputies. But if an incident arose regarding improper conduct by a particular deputy, my office could still get involved directly with that. And those deputies, if they're out making arrests, they need to be certified. So the Criminal Justice Training Council would have a direct role to play there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for coming all the way down here today, and appreciate you sharing your thoughts and giving us a lot to think about. We have one more witness before we break and go upstairs for the caucus of the whole. I'm going to invite Dave Silverman, who is one of the few people, I don't know the whole history, but one of the few high bailiffs that has ever been asked to actually perform the duties of high bailiff. So I asked Dave here today to talk a little bit about what that experience is like. Appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Dave Silverman. I'm the High Bailiff of Addison County. For a short while this past summer, I was also the county's acting sheriff. The High Bailiff is the one person elected in each county with authority to arrest the sheriff. The office, it's a vestige of British common law. It's a symbol of the importance of maintaining civilian control over law enforcement. And it's a constitutional era reminder that no one is above the law, not even the sheriff. Over the past few years, a lot of people have asked me just what the heck a high bailiff is. And look, it is kind of funny. But to me, the really funny thing is that while my office is actually quite easy to explain and understand, it turns out Vermonters have no idea what the sheriff does. Most people imagine the sheriff as the county's police force, there to rush to emergencies, solve crimes, and maybe teach Opie how to cast a rod. They certainly don't imagine a publicly funded, for-profit, business enterprise where the sheriff can do any darn thing he wants with the money at his disposal, can seemingly violate the law with impunity, and has no real law enforcement responsibilities unless and until someone ponies up the cash. That's certainly not what we need, but sadly it is what we have. So back to June, when I found out that Sheriff Newton was in jail, which also meant that I was acting sheriff, I called the office to speak with the ranking deputy, Mike Elmore, who's about to be sworn in as sheriff in a couple of minutes back in Middlebury, and talked with Mike about what his game plan was for the day. And Mike told me that he had already sent all the deputies home because he didn't want them interacting with the public and having to answer for Newton's criminal conduct every time they interacted with someone. And so I asked him, what was the game plan before Newton was arrested? And he said they were just going to be on traffic patrol that day. Nothing that couldn't be put off. What if there's an emergency? I asked him. He said, well, we don't respond to emergencies. That's the state police, or in our big towns, Middlebury, Bristol, Virgins, it would be the locals. We only come as backup if they call us. Do they ever call you? No, they never call. To me, this really begged the question, why do we have a sheriff? For courthouse security, you've already heard half the time that's done by private contractors. For prisoner transport, the Department of Corrections could do that. You give them $150 million a year. It's a core part of the corrections system anyway. For traffic patrol, that is the majority of what sheriff's departments do. But let's be honest, in reality, that's just fancy talk for setting speed traps. And if we're really being honest, it's this part of the job that fundamentally drives the disparities we see in policing, where Black and brown Vermonters are pulled over at 4 times the rate of white Vermonters. They're searched at 3 times the rate that white Vermonters who are pulled over are searched. And that leads to Black Vermonters being incarcerated at a rate 11 times that of white Vermonters. That is one of the worst racial disparities in prisons in the country. It's a shame on all of us. We can do better than this. We have to do better than this. Traffic safety, the majority of what they do, can be a function of the agency of transportation. You can accomplish that through a combination of unarmed civilian patrols, speed cameras, and safer road designs. And if you think it's too dangerous for unarmed civilian traffic agents out there because of all the guns, well, you can do something about that too. So I certainly don't want to discourage you from making incremental reforms, like disqualifying sheriffs who've lost their certification due to misconduct on the job, or clarifying that in fact a sheriff who embezzles $500,000 but does it through payroll has in fact embezzled and broken the law, or ensuring that a sheriff who violently kicks a handcuffed civilian in his custody can no longer perform that job. Those are all good things to do. But I'm really here to encourage you to do something more fundamental, bolder. If you really want to make a difference, abolish sheriffs. We don't need them anyhow. I'll gladly take any questions.
Representative Hooper.
Mr. Silverman, how do you just simply abolish sheriffs?
It would require, technically speaking, legally speaking, would require a constitutional amendment. Without a constitutional amendment, you do have wide authority to define the roles and powers of the sheriff. For example, the high bailiff has no constitutional definition of what the role is. It just says, the Constitution just says, you have to elect the high bailiff every 2 years. You've decided, the legislature has decided, that the high bailiff's duties and powers are to arrest the sheriff and be acting sheriff. You could do the same right here, right now, without a constitutional amendment for the sheriff. You could say the sheriff's only power and authority is to arrest the high bailiff. we could go around arresting each other all day long. You can set district boundaries. You could decide that there's one sheriff for the entire state, and you could give that sheriff whatever authority it is that you felt was actually necessary for a sheriff. But you see the creep. You have not, the creep of scope. You haven't set limits on what sheriffs do. And so, while I appreciate Sheriff Marcoux, he is definitely a good apple. There is no need for us to be creating homeless shelters associated with sheriff's departments. We can do that out of human services. We should. That's where it belongs.
Representative Morgan.
Not sure how to say, I guess I'll just say it. I have to vehemently disagree with you. For instance, the majority of the district I represent would have very little to no policing were it not for the sheriffs. So I don't think we're in a position where in Vermont we want to summarily dismiss sheriffs as an entity. That's this representative's opinion, but yeah, concerning to me greatly.
I appreciate that. And I will say that in my county, we have 23 towns. 3 of them have their own police forces. That leaves 20 without. Many of them, 14, contract with the sheriff. But what is it that the sheriff provides them? It's speed traps. That's it. When, even in those 14 towns that contract with the sheriff, when there is an actual law enforcement emergency, the state police is the one dispatched. And so what I put to you is that what we think sheriffs do and what sheriffs actually do, there is a wide gulf.
I don't want to get in a protracted debate with you, but I, again, disagree. I understand what you're saying, but presence also has some bearing. I understand what you're saying. They do some level of speed trap, sure. But there's obviously a difference of opinion, and that's fine. I'm welcoming your input there. You have some valid points in my opinion, but I think they do have, and you said it yourself, it's, the old 1090 rule, 10% can ruin the whole mix for the other 90% that do it right, like the 2 gentlemen we had on earlier, I think, do their departments justice and do it right. But my 2 cents, thank you.
And this won't be our last conversation about the structure of sheriffs and the amount of service and level of service and the different kinds of services they provide and the virtue of all of those things. So we'll have opportunities to dig into that, I believe, over the next few months. Representative Hango.
Thank you. I just want to speak for my rural communities that the nearest law enforcement without a sheriff is at a minimum 45 minutes away. And it could be much longer than that because not only do the Vermont State Police patrol and serve Franklin County, they also serve Grand Isle County. So they could be at the other end of the islands and someone in Richford, in one of my towns, needs them desperately. Currently, Richford does contract with the Sheriff's Office, the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, and depends on that contract to actually go on calls, emergency calls, and they do respond when they are on contract, when it's contracted time. Without them, we have nothing, although we are very fortunate to have the Border Patrol who graciously come to back them up when they are available, and we are very fortunate to have them. I will say that you're very fortunate in your area to have municipal police departments that can help out in those types of situations. But I recently heard from an EMT in my town of Richford, and they are seriously concerned because they're being called to go to homes where violence is happening, guns are being used, and they have no police backup. So without the sheriff being there, it's pretty tough for them to go in and actually help somebody who's having a medical emergency when there's also domestic violence happening. So while I appreciate your perspective, I will say it's not a one size fits all for the state of Vermont.
So I appreciate the comments. I want to make sure that while we have witnesses that we'll have time for committee discussion, I promise that we're asking them questions specific to their experience and why they're here today. So Representative Chase, and then I want to go over to our folks in judiciary, and we have just a couple more minutes before we all have to go to the caucus of the whole on the budget adjustment.
Are you envisioning allocating those resources among perhaps state police to address concerns of distance in a rural area, or?
I think that the conversation around policing and resources has frequently sort of stopped at the sort of defund stage, and people kind of like scream about that and stop the conversation. But you have to reallocate the resources. We do have serious public safety issues that are that the current system is failing to address. And so, yes, I absolutely would like to see the resources that are currently being misallocated and used in a way that is not working be used in more effective ways.
Thank you.
Representative Lalonde, anybody in the House Judiciary room have any questions for Mr. Silberman?
It does not look like it. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that wraps it up for today. We will be continuing some of this testimony. I'm hoping for tomorrow afternoon with State Auditor Doug Hoffer to learn a little bit about some of the information that he sent us. There are a number of documents about some of the financial concerns he brought up and that we've touched on today. But thank you very much, Dave. I really appreciate everyone who came, stayed. This was a morning where we probably have more questions than answers. And I really appreciate this committee and House Judiciary, the respectful tone and the questions. It's clear that there's an awful lot of work on these issues ahead of us. But for today, we're going to break. So thank you very much, House Judiciary. We're going to sign off.
Thank you.
So committee, we will be back here at 2. I wanted to let you all know that I will be along with Chair Marcotte and Chair Durfee over in Approps at 1:30 to talk about the rural infrastructure assistance grants. I think I got the right name there. Amendment that the chairs will be offering for the budget adjustment. And I'm going to go upstairs and talk about that.